Welcome back to One Brain Ops chess content. So, in this one, we're going to look over one of my games that I found when I was looking back through some of my recent games here. This was played 2 years ago, back in 2023, and it was a tournament game. It was actually the last round of this particular tournament. I had white, and we're going to just dive into it and show what I hope is an instructional game here. So, d4, e6. I'm not going to get too deep into the opening nuances here. It's definitely possible for white to just go ahead and play e4 here if you want to face a French, which I have done at times, but I went ahead and played bishop f4 in this game, so just sticking with a London. d5, e3, knight f6, knight d2, bishop e7, and I will say with knight d2, it's not actually essential in these lines where black plays e6 and blocks in their light squared bishop to play knight d2 before knight f3. I just kind of tend to do that out of habit. It's not like it's any worse. So bishop d3, continuing b6. And now b6 is sort of an interesting way of handling London as black. Ultimately, you're playing kind of a Queen's Indian setup. So if you're familiar with the Queen's Indian defense as black, this is sort of the system you're going for. Usually when you play the Queen's Indian, though, you don't have this pawn on d5. Usually it's either advancing just to d6 or it's still on d7 at the point that you play b6 and fianchetto your bishop. Even so, this can be kind of effective against the London because bishop, once it gets to b7, is actually helping to control the e4 square through the pawn. And white's big break in the position is e4. So if you can make it more difficult for white to play that, that's often helpful. In any case, though, I'm just going to continue developing. Knight gf3, c5. So this is one of black's big counter-attacking maneuvers in a lot of anti-London setups. Black needs to get this move in, and there is a threat to play c4 and hit the bishop. So whenever, as white, you're playing the London and you see c5, just play c3. And this way, if this attack ever happens, the bishop can just drop back to c2. And you can stay on this same diagonal. So knight bd7 is played. I castle. And now knight h5. So black could just continue with bishop b7, and that would be very natural. Ultimately, white is still going to be able to break through with e4, because if you just kind of count it up, right now white has two pieces supporting that break, and ultimately, if the bishop comes here, there are going to be three black pieces on it. White will be able to add a third by swinging the rook over. Sometimes you can add a fourth by playing queen c2. You can't really in this position because your bishop will get hit with c4, so that's not an option here. You can also think about queen e2, or even drawing arrows in weird places. You can even think about rook e2 and then queen e1 as an idea to try to continue supporting e4. Eventually, it is going to come through. So the question, if you have black, is do you want to play this in a way that when white does achieve e4, you're able to just trade off a bunch of pieces there? So a lot of times what I'll see when I play the London is we'll see these pawns end up getting traded when e4 happens, the knights end up getting traded, and then if this bishop has made it to b7, the bishops end up getting traded. And ultimately, in those situations, yes, white is able to make the last capture, but trading off all those minor pieces, the knight and the bishop, really does kind of take a lot of steam out of any kind of attacking chance that white has. And a lot of black players who just kind of want to survive this opening will play that way and just accept the fact that we're going into kind of an even middle game where neither side really has big attacking chances, but we're just going to kind of play for an end game. So you can play that way. My opponent chose to play a different way. He chose knight h5. So, yes, he's going to trade off the knight for the bishop, which, if you play the London, you should never really be worried about trading this dark squared bishop from the knight. Ultimately, it is your bad bishop. So, to define briefly what I mean by the good bishop and the bad bishop, because a lot of players don't really understand what that means, I've found. The good bishop is the one that is on the same color as the opponent's pawn chain, or put another way, on the opposite color of your own pawn chain. So in the London, white sets up all of their pawns on dark squares, meaning that the light squared bishop is the good one, and the dark squared bishop, the one on f4, is the bad bishop. And the other way to look at this is that black's pawns are set up on light squares. And I realize that right now, these three pawns over here are on dark squares, but this chain is not fixed. Eventually, this c pawn is probably going to get either traded or it's going to advance to c4 onto a light square. So it means that the light squared bishop is still going to be the one that is going to be capable of attacking black's pawn chain. There's no scenario here really where black's pawns are going to suddenly end up on dark squares. They're not going to be fixed on dark squares the way that white's pawns are right now. So, all that said, in the London and in similar, what I call pawn triangle openings like this, so the London, the call, and the Tory are all examples of this for the white side. As black, the Scandinavian, the French, the Caro-Kann are all pawn triangle openings. You should never be afraid to trade your bad bishop for a knight. So, a lot of times players playing against the London will go to great lengths to try to trade off the knight from f6 for this bishop on f4, and that's never a problem for white. I'm always happy to invite that trade to happen. Now, as happy as I am to invite that trade, I still want it to happen under favorable circumstances. I don't want to have to capture back with this pawn and mess up my pawn structure in the center. So the best way to reply to this is bishop g3. And now after knight takes, which was played in the game, you always want to capture toward the center when in doubt. So unless there's a tactical reason for capturing the f-pawn, like, for example, if there's some tactic on the f-file and opening up the rook will create something for you, unless there's some circumstance like that, you want to capture toward the center, so capture with the h-pawn. The other reason being that this keeps all of your pawns connected. So right now there's still, white only has one pawn island, whereas, and I'll back up and just show this.
I'm dreaming of the white pieces.
Yep, that was Fritz. So yeah, if you capture with the f-pawn instead, you've
What's
actually
going on?
now
You switch off my
disconnected.
book or something?
I don't know why Fritz is talking now. Hang on a second. Okay, there we go. I've turned off Fritz. He shouldn't bother us now. Anyway, as I was saying, now you've actually disconnected your pawns here, so I was going to highlight the squares in the f-file here. So you actually have two pawn islands. Why not? I'll highlight the other one in yellow. So, in terms of an end game, it's better to have fewer pawn islands, so that's the other reason that capturing toward the center is usually better. So, that's what I played, and we'll go back to the game now. So black continues by castling, and now e4. So black did, in trading off this knight, which was one of the pieces that was helping control the e4 square, and by not playing bishop b7 right away, black did essentially concede this e4 break, which is fine. It's not like that's a fatal mistake or anything like that, but ultimately, that is what black chose to do, and there are, trade-offs to everything in chess. Here, though, this is still about an equal position at this point, but this is where the position starts to sort of tilt in white's favor in this game. And it all starts with black's next move of c4. So the question is, why is that a bad idea to play c4? And ultimately, it's because you are fixing your pawns on light squares, which that was always going to happen to some extent, but you've now done it in a way that your bishop can never get out of this box. It's just going to be stuck back here. So black has actually kind of shut his own light squared bishop out of the game. This is also often called a French bishop because of how often this comes up in the French defense, where black plays a very early e6, d5, and blocks in this bishop. It also comes up in lots of other openings, and this is, of course, an example. But yeah, with this bishop now shut out, suddenly white has a bit of an edge here. And it's nothing major just yet, but it is a bit of an edge. So, bishop c2, so naturally wanting to stay on the b1 to h7 diagonal rather than going e2 and shifting off of that. That's the typical retreat for this bishop in the London. And now f6. So here, black still has a chance to capture here and keep the game a bit more open, keep this light squared bishop involved. By playing f6, okay, he's making it a little bit harder for white to achieve e5, but in fact, it doesn't really prevent it. White can play e5 here if he wants to. I ended up choosing to wait and prepare it, but yeah, e5 is actually playable right here. I played rook e1, bishop b7, so this bishop finally does develop itself. But now e5, and now the pawn chain is completely fixed here. And in fact, let's make them red. And this bishop is stuck and can't get out. And ultimately, if this exchange now happens on e5, so if black chooses to capture here, the idea is to capture back with the knight rather than the pawn. So we're not going to give black the chance to move this pawn. We're going to keep the pawn on d4. So ultimately, the knight would take back, and if black then chooses to trade knights, we take back with the rook, and we just make sure that we don't allow these pawns to advance, at least not easily. If black is really committed to it, they might be able to find a way, but that's not really in black's best interest here. In all likelihood, they're going to end up just losing this backward e6 pawn if they try that. So black actually did play the best move here, which is an ugly move to play, but it is the best, and that is f5. So now these pawns are permanently fixed. There's no capture on e5 anymore, and everything is fixed on light squares. So that really was black's best option, and it was a difficult move to play. I was a little surprised by it in the game. I just thought that black would want to keep things open, because when you shut one of your pieces out like this bishop is over here, it's like you're playing down a piece. White is going to be able to bring ultimately 6 pieces into the attack. All these remaining minor pieces, the queen and both rooks, and black is only going to be able to bring at most 5 to defend because this bishop is out of the game. And honestly, this rook is going to have trouble getting into it as well, as we're going to see. So white just has an advantage in having more pieces available right now. And when the center is completely closed off like this, where there's no possible way for black to open up the center, it makes it so that you can take the time to reroute your pieces, get them over there, and build that attack. And ultimately, black just doesn't have enough resources to be able to fight it off in a lot of cases. And that is certainly what happened in this game. So we're going to see that now. Now, interestingly, the engine wants to just start immediately. The engine wants to just play g4 and play this break over here, which does make some sense. Ultimately, we're going to temporarily sacrifice the pawn. If black captures it, the idea is ultimately that it opens up the bishop, and so even if black manages to hold on to this pawn for a while, giving the bishop this open line is just absolutely huge. So that was my plan, but I decided to prepare that g4 move a bit. Instead, I played knight h2. I wasn't comfortable just giving up the pawn. And knight h2 is dual purpose. It's both supporting the g4 break, and it's also allowing the f pawn to move up to f4, which is the other piece of this. And it can be a little bit scary too to think about pushing these pawns. And we're going to see in a few moves here what I mean. It can be scary to think about pushing these pawns when the king is sitting back here. But as we're going to see, white is the only one with attacking chances here. So I'll talk in a little bit of just kind of how to recognize that and why I knew that this would work out in the game. So knight h2, black continues on with b5. So black is going to try to break open on the queen side, which is really the only thing that he can try for here. And this is a pretty common idea in these lines where this pawn ends up advancing to c4 against the London structure, is that if you didn't end up capturing on d4 and breaking the center there, you want to try to break on b4. So there's definitely logic to what black is doing here. Again, the engine just wants to ignore that and play g4. I didn't ignore it. I played a3. So I'm fighting against this break a little bit. And naturally, this leads to a5, so supporting break further. In hindsight, this move a3 and then giving black the opportunity to play a5 and then potentially open up the a file after b4 and an exchange happens here, probably not necessary, and honestly probably gave black more chances than than I should have. So I should have just continued on with my attack on the king side, and ultimately I get back to it here. So once again, the engine wants to just play this right away. I wasn't ready. I played f4 instead, which is not bad. It's basically just preparing to play f5 in the event that black does capture here when I do play g4. So just wanting to make sure that I'm ready to jump in with that right away as soon as it becomes available and advantageous. Black plays bishop c6, and this is kind of, I think, where not exactly that black lost this game. It's just that I really think he needed to play b4. And this was ultimately the last opportunity to do it because white's attack is now coming very quickly. And bishop c6, I kind of understand what he wants to do. If he has the time to get the knight out of the way, the bishop can actually try to reroute itself over to the king side somewhere and hopefully participate in the defense of the king. But as it is, it's just not fast enough. So now I finally do play g4, and we're going to start breaking open the king. And it's kind of incredible how quickly this this attack comes together and how quickly the black king falls here. So black plays g6, and of course, we're just going to capture. So g takes f5, and now black is left with a pretty unpleasant decision to make. Of course, he's not going to capture with the rook because he doesn't want to give up the exchange. The bishop is still watching that. So he's got to choose which pawn to capture with. Capturing with the e-pawn will allow white to have a passed pawn. Not only that, a protected passed pawn on the 5th rank, and that's probably going to be enough to win if white can just simplify down to an endgame. So, not wanting to do that, black captured with the g-pawn. The problem there is that now the G file, which happens to be where the king is right now, is open. And I'm not going to waste any more time going after the king. I'm going to play G4 again. I'm going to bring the other the other G pawn up to G4. This is one nice thing, though, actually, if I go back to here. In these lines where black does trade off the knight for the bishop on G3, a lot of the times it can actually be kind of nice having this extra G pawn for exactly this. That you can kind of break on the G4 square multiple times. So if black ever does this and tries to set up a strong point on F5, I'm always happy to see that kind of thing for exactly this reason. So going back to the game position, I do go ahead and play G4 again. And then this is what I started to allude to a moment ago. It can be kind of scary to have no coverage in front of your king. You're just throwing all of your pawns forward, and that is certainly true. But ultimately, because my pieces here are all ready to jump into the attack, and black is not going to be able to get this bishop or rook over to help very easily, I was pretty confident that I would be okay here. And it turned out I was correct about this. Now, I should point out as well, black does have a defensive resource here that is difficult to spot. The best move according to the engine, and this is actually the case over the next several moves here, is knight to c5. And I'll go ahead and enter this in as a sideline, just so we can see it a little bit. The point is that you really can't take the knight. If you do capture it, right now with the king being wide open, bishop takes comes with check. And the idea is that now, once the king steps to a light square, black will be able to play d4 with a discovered check, and suddenly both bishops have come to life. This pawn can even make its way all the way up to d3. And so black has a ton of compensation for the piece. So in these lines, black is actually typically going to be better. I've played around a little bit with some of the engine lines, and so the result of this is that white cannot afford to take this knight, and so that means that the knight is eventually just going to be able to sit down on the e4 square, where it kind of interferes with white's operation. The bishop now is cut off, even after this pawn is traded and this diagonal may open up. The bishop will be cut off, and ultimately white probably has to trade off either the knight or the bishop just to get rid of black's strong piece here in the center. So this is a good defensive resource that black has if you can find it. It's still not enough to actually reach equality. In this exact position, if black finds this move, it's still plus 1.5. So white is still better, but this would have been a difficult move to meet, and I was lucky that my opponent didn't see it. And by the way, that this move is available to black for the next several moves. It's just not an easy move to spot. So continuing on, instead of that, not finding that resource, black tries to defend in other ways. So queen e8 is played, just trying to get the queen out here to one of these squares. That arrow didn't go where I wanted. There we go. Trying to get the queen out to one of these squares so that it can hopefully help defend the king. So we're just going to go ahead and continue the attack, and it is definitely possible to just capture right away here. I chose a different move, though. I chose king h1, and the idea is pretty simple. Just bring the rook over and get it onto this soon-to-be open file aimed right at the king. Once again, black does have knight c5 available, and this time, if white is to capture, well, d4 check just comes immediately, and then black will eventually capture back. So, yeah, that is still there for black to play, but it's difficult to spot. So instead, black plays king h8, which makes sense, just getting out of the way of the coming attack. So now rook g1, and once again, it was definitely possible to just capture here, but rook g1 played instead. and now queen f7. So black's idea here is to defend this pawn with something else other than the rook, because right now it's attacked by both the pawn and bishop, and black wants to be able to play rook g8, but if you play it in this previous position, this pawn just hangs. So white just breaks through. So by defending it with the queen, he gives himself now the option to play rook g8 next. However, after queen e2, rook g8, the purpose of queen e2 is just to get the other rook connected here so that it can swing over. And now when I go ahead and open up this g file, knight f8 is played, and really black didn't have a better option here than knight f8. Taking here is the engine recommended move, and I think that is probably best. The the problem and what black really didn't want to allow by taking here is that this pawn can advance right away with a fork and just win material. So that, I think, is why he played knight f8. The problem with knight f8, though, is that it disconnects the other rook here on a8. So I can just go ahead and play rook takes g8, and after king takes, I just swing the other rook over. So yes, I traded off one of my attackers, but I replaced it right away with one of my pieces that was not involved in the attack, and I traded off one of black's only defenders. So that was the idea of that. And now black has to get out of check, so the king moves again. And now f6. And yeah, there were multiple good moves here. And in fact, back to before the rook trade, I could have played f6 then, or even just captured here at that point. But I decided to trade the rooks first, check the king, and then play f6. And here, the reason that f6 is so strong is not even that it's like hitting the bishop or that it's a passed pawn. It's that after the bishop retreats, it allows rook g7. And now the game is basically ending here. So queen e8, and now queen g4, so threat of mate in 1. And after knight g6, well, we just take it. And now black has to give up the queen to stop mate. He chose instead to take with the pawn, and I'm sure that he did see that there was a checkmate here, just bringing the queen to the h file, but just decided to let the game end. So yeah, it is pretty incredible how quickly that all happened. If we just go back to this point here, yeah, when white plays g4 here, this is move 18 for white, and the game ends on move 31. So yeah, less than 15 moves. It's pretty quick. It's just opening up this G file, rip open the king side, and then just bring every piece that you can in. And in fact, I didn't even ultimately need all of my pieces. My knights are still sitting here back on the second rank, but they could have jumped in if needed. Either one of them can get to g5 pretty quickly here in 2 moves. So yeah, it would have been a simple matter to get more pieces if I needed them. I just ended up not needing them. So what is the lesson that can be learned from that game? Well, you can kind of see it in this final position here, where black is checkmated by white having extremely active pieces, and all of the pieces that could have helped black defend are stuck over on the opposite side of the board. The rook never moved. The bishop never got out from behind these pawns, and ultimately, in the end, the dark squared bishop was forced onto the back rank as well. So it turned out very poorly for black in the end there. But the reason that this attack happened was that black closed off the center and locked in his own bishop. So it's kind of a lesson of good bishop, bad bishop, and it's also a lesson of learning when to open the center, when to close the center, and how to play in those situations when the center does become closed. So I hope you enjoyed the game. I hope you learned something from it. And so thank you for watching One Brain Ups, and I will see you in the next one.